Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Yes, good afternoon or good morning, depending on what coast you're joining us from. I want to thank everybody for logging in early. We appreciate that. If you are here for the Astrix Technology Group Partner Webcast series of the Digital Laboratory, What the Future Holds, then you're in the right place. We haven't started yet. It is now 12:58 Eastern Time, and we plan on starting promptly at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. So we'll come back on in about 60 seconds and do a couple of pre-webinar announcements. So just sit tight, and we'll be getting started in just a moment. Okay, we're going to go ahead and do a couple of pre-webinar announcements for the folks that have joined us early. We appreciate that. A couple of quick things. We want to do a quick audio check. We're going to call this a check 1, 2, 3. Vasu, I'm going to unmute you, and I'd ask you to do a check 1, 2, 3, please.
Check 1, 2, 3.
Thank you very much. If we could get some folks who just go ahead and do that confirmation with the question or the chat panel, we would appreciate it. Okay, so that's confirmed. We can be heard, which is wonderful. All right, so before we go ahead and get it started, a couple of quick announcements. We will be recording today's session, so if for some reason you want to share this with your colleagues in your organization, you will get a copy of this probably within about 1 to 2 days following the session. Questions. We encourage everybody to ask as many questions as you like throughout the session. We will not stop and answer questions as we go through. However, what we will do is when we get to the end of the webinar, we will field as many questions as we have time for. And we will not read your name. We won't read your company. We will only read the question. We hope to wrap in about, I'd say, 40 minutes. That's what we try to keep the content to. So with that, we are now at 1 o'clock. There's going to be a brief pause so we can start the recording, and we'll be right back on to start the session. Hello and welcome to today's webinar, the Astrix Technology Group Partner Webcast series entitled The Digital Laboratory and What the Future Holds. Next slide, please. Today we are thrilled to be joined by L7 Informatics. The title of today's presentation, presented by L7 Informatics, is The Future is Now, addressing the digitalization of the laboratory. Next slide, please. Before we get into the content and pass it off to our speaker today, we'd obviously like to tell you a little bit about Astrix Technology Group if you don't know who we are already. We are sponsoring today's session, and we are sponsoring this webcast series. We are an informatics professional services and staffing company dedicated to the scientific community. Some background and quick stats. We were established in 1995 and originated from the IT division of a company called APBI, which was a $300 million life science organization. Today we operate from 8 offices with just over 800 employees and headquarters in beautiful Red Bank, New Jersey. There's 2 primary divisions we work with. That's the staffing division, which offers private and public staffing to IT and scientific resources, as well as the professional services division, which is whom you're speaking with today. We work with Fortune 1000 life science enterprise, government, and research institutions with large and fast-growing IT staffing and compliance needs, and our mission is and always has been to deliver scalable, sustainable solutions in IT and staffing for the scientific community. Next slide, please. In terms of the professional services and the work that we do with companies like L7 Informatics, we are a pro-serve organization. Within this, we have an end-to-end services that span the complete life cycle of scientific data systems. This includes everything from business process analysis and enterprise architecture, which is essentially making sure that when you're looking at a lab informatics project, it's beginning with the right design. Then there's the selection of the vendors and services, such as our friends at L7, and the development and implementation, and ultimately the computer systems and validation of these systems. There's, of course, then back-end services that we provide, such as solutions to help maintain your systems, and then scientific and technical staffing. Eventually, we turn this over to the customer, but along the way and throughout your life, we help evaluate, implement, and manage these systems to enhance the collection and processing of scientific data. That's enough about Astrix. Let's go ahead and get into the presentation materials. I'd like to go ahead and transition and introduce our speaker for today. So next slide, please. We're joined by Vasu Rangadas, who is the president and CEO of L7 Informatics, a leader in life science workflow and data management. Previously, Vasu was the chief strategy officer at Nant Health, and following its acquisition of Net.Orange, which was a company he founded, to provide an enterprise-wide platform to simplify and optimize care delivery processes in health systems. Before that, Vasu was the first employee of i2 Technologies, which is currently called Blue Yonder. This later grew to be a global company that revolutionized the supply chain market through innovative approaches based on the principles of Six Sigma and operations research and process optimization. So we're thrilled to have Vasu with us today. And Vasu, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, and you can take it from here. Your audio is coming through now.
All right. Thank you, Kevin. I still don't have any way I can minimize the GoToWebinar panel. Okay, that's good. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm going to talk to you today about digitalization in the lab. And I wanted to first start with, just showing this slide and talking about where do labs operate in the overall context of an enterprise, since we're talking about enterprise architecture today and lab digitalization. I wanted to show this slide, and I'm using the ANSI ISA model for level 0, level 1 to level 4. And so I've kind of redid the ISA slide to denote where typically labs and lab systems operate, which is at the level 3. Mainly in the research operations, clinical development and operations, and the manufacturing and the QC operations space. Now, what is digitalization? I'm not going to spend too much here, but it's essentially, there's a lot of confusion sometimes, but I wanted to make sure digitalization is not just digitizing paper and analog to digital, but it's also how do we use these digital technologies and have digital processes and transform departments within a company, how they interact with each other, and also how companies interact with their value chain partners. So if you look at a lab in the context of the enterprise, the digitalization of a lab essentially means it should be able to integrate directly through all the corporate systems to all the departmental system, upstream departments, downstream departments, and hence through the company network, through the partner network. So it's all about how do we integrate the lab to within the company and then the company to the ecosystem. Now, I'm going to talk about primitive models here. It's a framework that I'm using that I'll refer to shortly. But what to digitalize is a very, very important question, because people talk about digitalization. It could mean very different things. And one of the best ways to talk about digitalization is to break up, how do you make a digital lab into what are the primitives or the core building blocks of a digital lab? And I have them listed here from the bottom to the top. The first is a connector service. You need to have building blocks of connectors that will allow you to connect to instruments, equipment, analytical tools, and so on and so forth. And then there's a set of core services. Core services are commonly used services by everybody. These are things like security. These are file registries, audit services, security services, workflow services. These are all commonly used services that all the other services on the top will use. And the next big services are the data services, which contain all your data entity, the process services that contain all your workflows, and then your analytics and business intelligence services, and then a knowledge graph service. And then you have an API, which is the most critical part of this. The components of a digital lab is the API service. So this is important for it to connect to everybody else in the ecosystem. Now, I'm going to take a slight step back from there, saying, why do we need to digitalize the lab? And I'll give you about 3 or 4 slides that talk about different use cases and different types of organization. And the first one is there's this whole move from existing processes to moving to an industry 4.0, and named it Lab 4.0, where information is easily available. Everything is connected to each other. There is full visibility to what is happening. And now that we're in the context of the lab, visibility of what is happening in the lab. Where are my samples? When will this test be over? All of these needs to be available and fully transparent to anyone. So looking into the lab. Then there is predictability, the ability to predict what is going to happen. Are my tests going to be late? Is this test going to fail? While you'll need a lot more analytical tools like AI and ML, but you need a fully digital lab for these systems to introspect and get the information it needs to make those decisions. And then finally, one of the core principles of Industry 4.0 is self-optimization. If something is going wrong, how can I alert, react, and self-correct myself? And that's the ultimate goal. So that's one of the things to start is with the basic digitalization. The second use case is in a big pharma company, you have several divisions, each division making different products, and each product might be researched and tested in multiple different central labs, and each lab has their own siloed different systems and instruments. Now, all of this data is across many, many different departments and many, many different labs. And this siloed lab data management systems reduce the overall velocity of the business. You have very little visibility to the cost of product development. There's a lot of data integrity issues. If there's regulatory compliance requirements, you don't know where your product is in its life cycle because everything is distributed across many different siloed data systems. The visibility to experimental results is poor and mostly paper-based, and also poor visibility into asset utilization. And then there is very little sharing of best practices across these different divisions and across different product lines. Another reason to digitalize the lab, and this is a case of a research organization, and there's many pharma, academic institutions, governments, and others who have large lab networks. Again, most of these labs have different systems, different ELN systems, different biorepository systems, different LIMS systems, different freezer management systems. And again, there's a lack of visibility of the research data as well as the scientific knowledge that is generated in these research labs across the organization. There's a lot of redundant systems, and existing ELN and LIMS systems are not able to handle advances in technology. So you have NGS or proteomics or CRISPR-Cas9, new technologies come in, new instruments come in. The older LIMS systems are not able to handle some of the newer scientific advances, so they end up buying new LIMS systems and create more silos. So there's lack of this enterprise-wide scientific data and process management system is beginning to get very expensive for IT to maintain and pay for and not to mention all the negatives of having data in different silos. On the diagnostic side, on a similar use case, you have different departments. You have a technology, assay R&D team, you have a product development team, then you have a CAPLIA lab operations team, and then you have sales and customer service. Again, each of these groups use their own siloed systems. There's different systems for R&D, different systems for commercial operations. And when the workflow starts from ordering and sample preparation to NGS and bioinformatics to report generation, there's again siloed databases that do each of these functions. And again, these cause data integrity issues for regulatory compliance. The processes that are in their quality management systems are not mapped one-on-one to their IT systems, making audits very difficult and very paper-based. And also the CAPLIA, the certifications are very difficult to do because everything is siloed and paper-based. The next case study or example of why digitalization is important is a biotechnology company. Typically has an R&D department, then you have development and clinical trials, and then you have manufacturing and QC. So the product lifecycle stage, again, has a lot of different siloed LIMS and ELN systems across R&D, CleanOps, manufacturing, and QC. There's very poor exchange of information about the protocols and the assays that are moved from R&D to CleanOps. And in some cases, these are passed on to CRO, central labs, as well as CDMOs. And there is no electronic interchange of these protocols existing today. And this dramatically reduces business velocity and efficiency, increasing the cost of drugs produced and the speed at which drugs are produced. And again, the same issues that I mentioned before in terms of regulatory compliance. The siloed IT systems don't easily map to the QMS processes, and audits are difficult to perform. Now that we have looked at why do we need this digitalization, I'm going to talk about how do we digitalize existing systems, or there's a case of if you don't have any existing systems, what kind of systems should you be getting so that your entire lab is digitalized. So there's three mechanisms that are proposed here. One is having overlay systems. The second one is having unified platforms. And the third is a hybrid. You can have using a unified platform as an overlay system in case you already have existing systems and you don't want to replace them. So going to the first slide of looking at how overlay systems can be used. I'm just showing you an example of a lab, a diagnostic lab in this case, where there's a workflow from ordering to accessioning to preparation to sequencing to sign-off and results. And the data is sitting in multiple different siloed systems. Those are the blue boxes that you see there. And that's the current as-is architecture. And some of the data is in the cloud. Some of it is on-premise. It's all over the place. One approach is to take that entire siloed boxes and make an overlay system that creates a common information model across the entire workflow from ordering to results, and also creates a process orchestration engine that continues to synchronize between the existing ordering system, the existing LIMS system, the existing bioinformatics sequencing pipelines, and content management systems. So the overlay systems could be as simple as just a data overlay that could just combine all the information and provide real-time view of what is happening in a dashboard, or it could be a process orchestration engine or a combination of both. So you get both workflows and a real-time view of what is happening in the lab. The second approach is unified platforms. So instead of integrating different siloed systems, you create a unified platforms. And this is a an article that was published by Michael Chandler at Gartner that talks about unified platforms are better suited for enterprise enablement. And that's essentially what digitalization means of a lab. It's essentially to enable the lab to become part of the enterprise. So this is a good paper to read for those of you that are interested in how to make this happen. And unified platforms with common models and code and tooling and architecture and having business processes that span multiple capabilities are the easiest way to digitalize a lab. So the architectural framework here is you take all these point solutions and you replace it with a unified platform that has ability to connect to various things, has their services, has an API, and all the apps that you need from ELN to LIMS to analysis to manage the lab that you have. And the third approach is to have a hybrid approach where you have an overlay system. So you still keep your existing LIMS system, your existing bioinformatics pipeline, but you overlay another system and you use some of the apps that are provided by this overlay system. So the existing system may not have a good reporting framework, so you can use the reporting application, or it may not have a good sample accessioning and inventory and analysis tools. So you can use those services in conjunction with the existing systems that you have. So this is the third approach where it's a hybrid model of an overlay as well as using new apps. Now the fourth approach is really not an approach, but it's more of a methodology, I would call it. And I'm going to explain what this primitive models versus composite models are. And excuse the picture there, it's a bad picture. I was trying to take a screenshot, but primitive models are essentially the lowest common unit of a building block. In this example, the primitive model of a wiring of a Ford 64 Mustang, and then the composite model is the whole car. So primitive models are combined to create composite models, and use this, refer to this book, The Enterprise Architecture Using the Zachman Framework. If those who are interested should definitely read that book to get a good idea of how to create reusable components, because it's really a key to create digitalized labs. So what I'm going to talk to you today about what we've identified as what are the primitive models for a digital lab. And some of these may be up for discussions, questions, and arguments or debates, but these are the models that we have right now that I'm proposing, and of course some of these can be changed and modified and added, but it's a start. So the first one is applications. You need users to interact with the systems through a user interface, so you need apps. So those are primitive models. Then you need connectors that are reusable and then that connect to different instruments. And some core services like defining users, security, governance, audit trails, workflows. These are core services that are used across the board. The fourth one is data entities. You have different kinds of data entities for different labs, samples, customers, vendors, assets. And I'll show you some more examples in the future where the platforms need to be flexible on how you create these entities and how, because entities are very, very flexible. Each lab has different kinds of entities. If you're doing NGS, you might have RNA or DNA as entities, but if you're doing toxicology, you might have different kinds of entities. If you're doing chemistry, you might have different entities. And the next one is process, protocols, workflows, workflow chains. So what is the smallest unit that is reusable, and then be able to combine those units to create bigger workflows, which will then define your experiments and your tests. The sixth primitive is analytics. These are all your algorithms, your R libraries, your SAS libraries, your bioinformatics, and your AI and machine learning libraries that are all getting integrated into the lab of the future. The next is business intelligence. And I've included it here because the dimensional model to slice and dice the lab data and the results data, both operational and scientific, is very critical to have a view into the future, what's going on in the lab, what's going wrong, why are certain experiments not producing the results. So having a fully integrated business intelligence tools are very important part of the primitive model of the digital lab. The final one is a knowledge graph. Whereas the business intelligence is giving you visibility into trending and what's going to happen in the future, what happened in the past. Knowledge graph is a graphical link of all of the master and transactional data and allows you to navigate through the network of knowledge that you've generated in the lab over the n number of years. And it's very important for collaboration. It's very important for within the organization collaboration as well as across organizations. So now I'm going to go a little bit more deeper and give examples of few of these primitives. For example, data primitives. Data primitives could be anything from definitions of vectors and assets to subjects to patients to kits to tumor to blood, and all of these are data primitives, and each of them will have their own attributes or set of attributes. And data primitives are then combined to create data schemas that are specific for one particular lab. And as the lab changes and modifies, if you go from a research lab to a QC lab, then you add more of these data primitives that make sense, such as environmental monitoring models and things like that. The next set of primitives are process primitives, and these are protocols. And protocols or process primitives could be scientific protocols or primitives. They could be integration primitives. They could be analytic primitives. And at the end of the day, these operational, scientific, as well as connectivity primitives are all integrated to create protocols. From these low-level protocols, you connect them to create workflows, and then you combine these workflows to create larger assays or tests or experiments. So this is how you build up composite objects like tests and experiments and assays from smaller primitives called protocols. And this makes the lab more reusable, and it's much more efficient and changeable to business processes that are constantly changing, as well as the changes in scientific technologies. And these are the connector primitives, essentially built to all the different instrumentations that need to be used as part of a digital lab, because you don't want to have any manual processes in a fully digital lab. And then these are the app primitives. I just threw a few in there. You have your LIMS, inventory, sample management, ELN, etc. So the combination of all of these primitives can be used to create composite applications to digitalize the lab. And I use the analogy here of a house, similar to the car analogy that I used before, that are built with building primitives like windows and doors and light bulbs. Or another example is the Lego blocks, where you have a lot of primitives, which are Lego blocks, that can be combined to create an infinite number of composite models. So that's essentially the philosophy of some of these larger IT frameworks, like the Zachman frameworks, is you build primitive models and then you build composites out of those. So this is an example of how we've used these different primitive models of connectors, core services, data entities, processes, protocols, and then created this composite for running laboratories and digitalizing labs. A good example of one success story of such a composite structure was at one of our customers. They had a Lyme disease diagnostic test that was using NGS. When COVID-19 came, they were able to create a COVID-19 test by reusing essentially all the primitive protocols, the apps, everything in less than 2 weeks to create a new diagnostic test, which was fully CAP/CLIA compliant. So this shows the power of having validated components that are in primitives that can be very quickly assembled into larger composites, whether they be a test or a workflow, it doesn't matter. But the whole point is having this framework that allows you to do that. The next thing I'm going to talk about is roadmaps, because you can't get from A to B or an IT architecture A to an IT architecture B, or you can't digitize everything overnight. So roadmaps are an important way to manage a technology strategy. And and it involves a lot of processes, all the way from what are the triggers, what are the issues driving this, and what are the business drivers, or the internal drivers, or the IT drivers, and then what are your capabilities that you have in your existing organization. What do you want to keep? What do you want to sunset? And then once you have that, then you do your technology roadmap. Here are the gaps. Here's what I have to fill. Here's the connectors I have to connect to, things like that. So creating a roadmap is very, very important. But it is, before you do the roadmap, it's very important to do an as-is architecture assessment to basically understand what you have, as well as what systems are in place and what you want to keep, and then decide on a 2B architecture, and then come up with a roadmap. And this framework allows you to not only provide opportunities, and also, more importantly, prioritization. So your business drivers need to drive your solution architecture and your roadmap priorities. It shouldn't be the other way around. So it's very important for business and IT to work collaboratively with each other to understand what business drivers are the most important, and then help with the solution architecture. And that will lead to a much more favorable project, because everyone's on the same page in terms of why we're doing what we're doing. And also, roadmaps help with evaluating different designs and understanding the cost, the timing, the efficiencies, what are the requirements, etc. Because each design might have different roadmaps and different costs. I'll mention here one reference here for technology road mapping by Robert Fowle. Is a really excellent book on doing these roadmaps. And again, I highly recommend that, because digitalization is not easy. There's a lot of options, and you need to integrate with your the rest of your enterprise, and as well as business drivers. And how do you fund this project? How do you show return on investment? A lot of these things are very critical for it to be successful. I'm going to end my presentation, talking about L7. L7 was recently named by Gartner as a 2020 Cool Vendor in Life Sciences, mainly because of the platform that was developed. And it is very important for companies looking to more innovation and drive more out of their R&D pipelines, or digitalizing their labs, creating novel therapeutics, or creating new commercial engagement models. Platforms like what ESP has are an important part of a toolkit that is necessary to digitalize not just the lab, but the surrounding ecosystem. And I'm going to stop now and see if there's any questions, and I appreciate you guys giving me the opportunity and the time to listen to this talk.
Great. Thank you, Vasu. Very much appreciate that. A couple of things real quick before we get into any questions. And obviously, I want to encourage the folks that are on the call. If you haven't asked any yet, please, I encourage you to do so now as we get ready to kind of wrap things up. I will stop the recording.